Pie in the Sky Media. This series contains adult language and descriptions of graphic violence throughout. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome back to Criminal Mischief with Carolyn and Brandon. You're listening to episode 126, Satan's Shadow. Hi, Criminal Mischief Nation. Many of you may already know this, but my co-host, Brandon Morgan, also is the creator and host of the hit podcast, The Devil Within. And this week you're in for something special, because you're about to hear episode 1 of Brandon's newly released 4th season of The Devil Within, called Satan's Shadow, a deep dive into the Night Stalker case. But Brandon's storytelling is so visceral you will be hanging by the edge of your seat the entire time, because he's going to transport you back into 1984 Los Angeles, a time when the City of Angels is under siege by a devil-worshipping serial killer. Here's episode 1 of Satan's Shadow.
EVO. This series contains adult language and depictions of graphic violence. Listener discretion is advised.
Celebrating the 23rd Olympiad of the modern era, I declare open the Olympic Games of Los Angeles.
More than a decade ago, I worked for a guy, a great boss, who was a native Los Angelino. Now, if you've spent any time in Los Angeles, you're familiar with the notion that there just aren't that many people who were born and bred here in the Southland. Of course, that's an exaggeration, as the number of citizens in the greater Los Angeles area that were born there number in the millions. But it's true that there are a ton of transplants from across the globe that have settled in the City of Angels, more than any city on earth. And for a simple reason: it's a great place to live. The weather, the beaches, the opportunity. It's far from perfect, but so's everywhere else. So why not enjoy the sunshine, right? But one particular day in late spring, my boss, who had lived all of his 50-plus years in LA, had something on his mind. It was a slow day, so we had time to talk. And he remarked that he could feel the summer on the wind blowing in from the east, and that he hoped it wouldn't be a particularly hot one this year. Not, he said, like it was almost 30 years ago, during the '84 Summer Olympics. That was a brutal summer, in more ways than one. Then he said something that I clearly remember. He said, "No one knew it at the time, but as a city, we were in limbo." And what did he mean by that? You see, no one knew that while Los Angelinos were all waiting to welcome the world to their city for 2 weeks of athletic competition held in the spirit of peace and brotherhood, that a truly evil person had already begun a crime spree that would terrorize millions and make them all question if California was really the place to be. In the secular sense, to be in limbo means to be in an uncertain state, caught between two distinct stages where it's unclear what will happen next. But in Catholic theology, limbo with a capital L is defined as the afterlife condition of those who die in original sin without being assigned to the hell of the damned. The limbo my boss was referring to was an uncertain time in Los Angeles, a 9-month period that began on June 28, 1984, with the murder of an elderly woman in the Glassell Park neighborhood of LA, and ended in March of 1985, when evidence collected at a different murder scene in a different neighborhood let investigators know that a serial killer was on the loose. From that moment on, the City of Angels was no longer in limbo. The descent into hell had begun. Welcome to Season 4 of The Devil Within, Satan's Shadow. You're listening to Episode 1, Limbo. There are a handful of literary works in the Western canon that are considered standard bearers, the masterpieces, the must-reads. We have the Canterbury Tales, the Iliad, Don Quixote, and of course, Dante Alighieri's The Divine Comedy. If you're not familiar, don't let the title fool you. It's not a book of humorous stories. In Dante's time, 14th century Italy, epic poems were placed in one of two categories, tragedy or comedy. But what those terms meant then are very different from what we understand today. They were either so-called high stories, tragedies, that tackled serious issues and were written in the classical Latin, and therefore mostly unavailable to the general public, or so-called low stories, referred to as comedies. These stories generally had happy endings and were written in the low or vulgar Italian language. These comedies were widely read by the commoners and became very popular as a result. Alighieri was among the first of his time, that time being medieval Europe in the decades that preceded the Black Death. He was among the first of his time to combine the two categories of epic poetry. He wrote in the low language of Italian on a subject of the utmost importance, the redemption of humanity. The Divine Comedy was written in three parts: Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso. For our purposes, over the course of this series, we'll be exploring Dante's Inferno and how it relates to the events that took place, mostly in Los Angeles, between June of 1984 and August of 1985, when the city came under siege by a madman who claimed to be doing the work of the devil, a man who had come to be known as the Night Stalker. Before we dive into the macabre and sinister world that a troubled, broken young man created all on his own, it'll be helpful to first take a quick detour into another macabre and sinister world and learn about the man who created it, Dante Alighieri. Alighieri was born in the year 1265 in the politically fractured and intellectually robust world that was Florence, Italy. Dante was of noble birth, but not from a particularly wealthy family. Still, he received a classical education in grammar, rhetoric, and philosophy, with a strong emphasis on the great works of the Latin poets Virgil and Ovid. He was also exposed to the teachings of Aristotle, which affected him greatly, but none more than the intensive, years-long study of Christian theology, a body of work that would influence his future literary masterpieces. By the time he began to work on his Divine Comedy, Dante had clearly understood his own beliefs, both in the soul's journey towards God, as well as his worldview of medieval Europe regarding religion, politics, philosophy, and science. And it would all come together for one of the most important works ever written. And it all begins in Limbo. But back to that day when my boss was reminiscing about, what, the Olympics? No, it was something much more serious, because he mentioned his two young children in a way that let me know the fear he felt for their safety still lingered all these years later. But why this day? Why June of 2013 to suddenly dig up some ancient memories where he felt vulnerable, powerless, and still kind of terrified? Then he revealed it. He said, Richard Ramirez died in prison yesterday. That name didn't ring a bell, so I responded, friend of yours? Gosh, man, I'm really sorry. He chuckled a little and shook his head. No, serial killer. Newspapers called him the Night Stalker. That was the first I had ever heard of this prolific, crazed murderer who also worshipped the devil and claimed to kill in the name of Satan. He was active in the Los Angeles neighborhood where my boss still lived, and his house was considered particularly dangerous for a terrifyingly random reason. No one knows why, but at the pinnacle of his rampage, Ramirez chose victims that lived in blue houses within a block of a freeway off-ramp. My boss, as you've probably figured out, lived in a blue house within a block of a freeway off-ramp. A big chunk of his anxiety was retroactive, as he, along with the rest of the city, had their guard down during that entire 9 months of the limbo he described. And it was an incredibly active 9 months, especially in Los Angeles. As mentioned, the Summer Olympics were a stunning success as well as a financial windfall for the city.
It costs up to $200 to attend some of the events here, and some fans would have you believe that it's easier to buy a ticket to a Michael Jackson concert than to an Olympic event. But despite any complaints, the fans just keep on coming. So many, in fact, that the Summer Games organizers say this will be the best attended Olympics in history. By the time it ends, some 6 million spectators will have been here. Everyone expected a big crowd at the opening ceremony, and 92,000...
Then we had the Showtime LA Lakers, who were attempting to defend their world title. They would fail in that, but still, it was a hell of a ride.
Here's Kareem, outlet to Worthy, Rambis. And now let's watch it. Cooper and the Celtics, and now the bench is empty. As Larry Bird helps Kurt Rambis up, he was decked by 2 Celtics and hit the floor hard, and both benches have emptied.
And this was followed just a few months later by a presidential election that saw the former California governor, Ronald Reagan, win a second term in a historical political beatdown that saw the president win 49 states. He only lost Minnesota and the District of Columbia, and win the popular vote by 18 points.
And I want you to know that also, I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I am not going to exploit, for political purposes, my opponent's youth and inexperience.
Reagan assured the country that it was, quote, morning in America, while he took on the evil empire of the Soviet Union and guaranteed that the conservative wave that he ushered in 4 years earlier would continue for 4 more and beyond. As the calendar changed to 1985, brutally cold weather was gripping much of the nation. Bruce Springsteen released Born in the USA. Michael Jordan has emerged as the NBA superstar the world needed, and Mikhail Gorbachev became the Soviet premier. But back in Los Angeles, something awful had been festering in the drug-addled mind of a lunatic. He had already experienced his first kill and was hungry for more. Dante's Divine Comedy begins with Dante himself as the main character, a 35-year-old in the year 1300. It's the night before Good Friday, an important date on the Christian calendar when Christ is believed to have hosted the Last Supper before his crucifixion the following day. Dante is lost in a dark wood, frantically being chased by beasts that he's unable to outrun. He's eventually saved, miraculously, by the Roman poet Virgil, author of the Aeneid, among other classical Latin works. Together, the two men, with Virgil as the guide, journey into the underworld for a comprehensive tour of the 9 circles of hell, and their first stop is Limbo. Dante takes a very interesting view of Limbo, a personal view. While he adheres to the medieval Christian theology that salvation is available only through the grace of God, still, through no fault of their own, there are many, many important thinkers and artists that greatly influence Dante that reside in Limbo. But is that really fair? They never even had the opportunity to know the divine love of Jesus. And why? Simply because they lived and died centuries before Christ was born. What kind of just and merciful God would allow this to be? Dante spent years in contemplation of this apparent catch-22, as has much of Christendom. It's not the fault of billions of people who lived virtuous lives before the time of Christ that they were never baptized, is it? The big argument that the Church has wrestled with for millennia concerns the unfortunate children who die in childbirth without the chance to be saved through Jesus. Why do they have to live in limbo for eternity, denying the already aggrieved parents the hope of seeing them again in heaven? For Dante, it was the poets, the masters of their crafts, that concerned him the most. So he made limbo beautiful, painted in hues of gold and green, with gentle streams, and the air perfumed with wild flowers and soft, warm breezes that echo with the laughter of children. And Dante's heroes, Homer, Ovid, Socrates, and Aristotle, all hold distinguished positions. But despite their greatness, they exist in a state of eternal separation from God, a condition they are acutely aware of. Here, unlike the deeper levels of hell, they're not subjected to grotesque, unending tortures, but they are forever denied entrance to heaven, a punishment Dante describes as perhaps more subtle but equally devastating. Their undeserved punishment is to be eternally desirous of salvation. Dante the poet is seemingly at odds here with Dante the man, as he appears quite content to stay in the majestic fields of limbo, kind of starstruck by all the scholars and philosophers whose fate he is very obviously unsettled by. But Virgil implores him to continue the journey into the second circle. The limbo that Los Angeles found herself in would end in March of 1985, as the true scope of the carnage that would be visited upon the city was brought into stark relief in the most violent of ways. As stated, the limbo began in the early hours of June 28, 1984. Jenny Vinkow was a 79-year-old widow living alone in the Glassell Park neighborhood of Los Angeles. It was early summer, but it was already brutally hot. So hot that Jenny took to sleeping with a few windows open in her ground floor apartment to allow the cool night air to balance out the heat of the day. It was sometime after midnight that an unknown assailant, someone who moved with the insidious grace of a cat burglar, quietly removed the screen from one of the open windows and entered the apartment. It's believed that the break-in was at first a random crime of opportunity. The perpetrator happened to be wandering the streets and noticed the open window. The original intent was a simple burglary, maybe? And again, maybe the intruder accidentally woke up the resident, Jenny Vinkow, and things got out of hand real quick. But no. That's a convenient starting place for detectives when it comes to robberies like this. But unfortunately for the cops, the evidence just didn't pan out that way. It was determined that Miss Vinkow never woke up, and that the extensive wounds she endured were all inflicted while she was either asleep or after she was dead. And by excessive, I mean multiple stab wounds to her head, neck, and chest, a vicious sexual assault, and then, as a brutal final touch, Miss Vinkow's throat was cut so viciously that she was nearly decapitated. Jenny Vinkow, originally from Brooklyn, New York, had only lived in Los Angeles for the previous 3 years, having moved out west to be near her grown sons, one of which suffered from a mental illness and spent much of his adult life confined to an institution. It was Vinkow's other son, 47-year-old Jack Vinkow, who stopped by to visit his mother on the morning of June 28th. It's interesting, in a clinical sense, how our minds work when faced with a potential disaster. Some things get blurry, like trying to describe what someone looked like during a robbery. But other things become crystal clear and anchor in our minds. And both of those phenomena are caused by the same survival instinct, honed over millions of years of evolution that exists in the human brain. Pattern recognition or pattern disruption. A disturbance in the endless sea of tall grass on the African savanna? That's a disrupted pattern, and it could mean that a hungry lion was about to make you its lunch. Adrenaline rushes, muscles flex, heart rate spikes, fast, deep breaths. Everything physical in answer to a mental distress call that allows our survival instinct to completely take over and get us the hell out of there. And that initial stimulus, that disturbance in the grass, gets anchored in our brains and then becomes not a pattern disruption that startles us, but a pattern to look for, to prevent the need for such an intense physical response in the future. Okay, so what did Jack Vinkow see as he made his way up the walk to his mom's apartment? Two things. One was a window screen that was out of place. First of all, it wasn't in the window frame where it belonged. It was discarded, just tossed into the bushes. A maintenance worker wouldn't be so careless. It would be leaning against the building right near the window. Vinkow's brain raised a slight alarm. And then a moment later, he saw the second thing that put him into full panic mode. The door was wide open. Jack Vinkow, now fully convinced that something terrible had happened, rushed into the apartment and called for his mother several times with no response. Moving quickly now, he went into his mother's bedroom and discovered her body. Jack sprinted out of the apartment and pounded on the door of the manager, screaming, "Call the police! My mother's been murdered!" The reason Vinkow's recollection of the discarded window screen and the open front door were so important to investigators was twofold. The first reason was immediately important. The screen became evidence, as they were able to get a good fingerprint off of it. The second was that the details provided by Vinkow established a partial MO. And in a case like the Night Stalker, where consistency in victims, murder weapons, and locations was virtually non-existent, an established method of operation, at least when it came to gaining entry to a victim's residence, proved to be invaluable. But investigators wouldn't even be close to connecting those dots for almost 9 months. March 17th, 1985. It was a Sunday, but it was also St. Patrick's Day, and celebrations were underway across the U.S. 22-year-old Maria Hernandez came home from spending the evening at her boyfriend's house at approximately 11:30 p.m. She lived with a roommate, a 34-year-old woman named Dale Okazaki. The two shared a condo owned by Okazaki in the LA suburb of Rosemead. Rosemead is about 20 miles west of Los Angeles in the San Gabriel Valley, a working-class community made up primarily of Asian and Hispanic residents. The condo, at 8510 East Village Lane, was made up of 5 units that all had their own 2-car garages that were accessed by way of an alley that ran parallel to East Village Lane directly behind the condo complex. As Maria approached her garage, she pressed the button on the opener she had in her vehicle, waited approximately 8 seconds for the door to fully open, and pulled into her spot directly beside her roommate Dale's car. The women had laid out narrow carpet runners on the driver's side of both cars to make it easier and safer to walk into their home, especially when it rained. Maria put her car in park, turned the engine off, and exited the vehicle. As she approached the door that led into the condo, she pressed the button to close the garage door. All basic stuff she had done hundreds of times. Maybe that's why she had let her guard down. No one thinks anything's going to happen in your own garage. What she didn't know was that a madman had been following her. Maria's gold Camaro, for some reason, had appealed to this deranged man who had been aimlessly driving the freeways of Los Angeles in a stolen Toyota. As Maria pulled into the alley, the man parked the stolen car out of sight and hurried toward the opening garage door. Without Maria's knowledge, he had snuck inside as the Camaro pulled in. Remember, the total time it took for the big garage door to automatically open or close was 8 seconds. So all this happened pretty quickly. The man who had snuck into the garage had a weapon, a .22 caliber pistol. But it wasn't pointed at Maria, not yet. And the reason why will inform law enforcement as to the type of perpetrator they'd be looking for. Instead, as the garage door was closing, the stranger did a strange thing. He loudly banged with both hands on the roof of Maria's roommate's car. Why? To get her attention. He wanted her to see what was about to happen to her. Picture the scene, especially how it must have sounded. Carpet runners on the concrete floor muffled the sound of his footsteps. The noise of the automatic garage door motor easily masked the sound of the man's breathing or even his voice if he tried to call out to Maria. And he didn't like that. He needed his presence to be known. So, the violent, hollow sound of fists on the roof of a car definitely got Maria's attention. The intruder raised the weapon just as Maria turned around, startled. The killer saw the fear in her eyes, and that was exactly what he wanted. Maria, sensing imminent danger, raised her hands in front of her face in desperation as the stranger pulled the trigger. That's the exact moment the lights went out. Anyone who's familiar with an automatic door opener realizes that the light is also automatic. You learn the timing of the thing. You get into the routine of being inside the house by the time the light goes off and the garage door is closed. But she was delayed, distracted by the intruder, and it saved her life. After the gunshot, she fell in a heap on the floor of the garage beside her car. The would-be killer walked up to her and kicked her motionless body aside to gain access to the main house. He didn't realize that Maria Hernandez was alive and basically unharmed. How? She was shot in the face from a range of less than 10 feet. But the automatic light from the garage door opener had suddenly gone out and cast the room into darkness. And for a long moment, the intruder, according to his own words, thought he had been transported to hell. In the few moments it took his eyes to adjust and for him to realize that he was in fact still in the garage in Rosemead, Maria knew that her best chance of survival was to play dead. She also had no idea how she had survived the shooting, but she had the early, faint tingling of a wound to her right hand. It would later be discovered that the bullet fired by the intruder had ricocheted off her car keys and grazed the outside of her hand. As the intruder made his way into the home, Maria stayed calm. Once he was inside, she opened the garage door and fled down a passageway that connected the back alley with East Village Lane, and along the way, she heard another gunshot. Now let's back up approximately 60 seconds. Inside the condo, Dale Okazaki hears the garage door open and correctly assumes it's her roommate, Maria, getting home from work or her boyfriend's, whatever her schedule was that day. Maybe they were going to go out for a late drink to celebrate St. Paddy's, maybe not. Either way, Dale heard what went down next in the garage. The bang on the roof of the car, followed by a gunshot. And when the door opened seconds later, she hadn't registered danger yet, and her back was to the intruder. Her next recollection was shaking the dizziness out of her brain and the searing pain of being pistol whipped in the back of her head. Wait, as she gathered her senses, she understood that meant someone was in the house. Adrenaline rushed through her body as she regained her senses and slid back against the cabinets beneath the kitchen counter. This particular counter was more like a kitchen island, as the dining room was directly on the other side. That's where the bad guy had to be, because she could see the rest of the first floor of her condo from where she was hiding. But she couldn't hear anything, not a footstep, not a breath, not even her own heartbeat. Maybe he'd left? Could it be? Was she safe? She turned, got on her knees, grabbed the top of the kitchen counter with both hands, and slowly raised herself over the edge to take a peek. The killer was standing like a statue, his gun aimed in the exact spot where Dale Okazaki had the misfortune of raising her head to get a better look. She was shot directly in the middle of her forehead. She was dead before her body hit the floor. All this happened in less than a minute, but to Dale and Maria, it must have felt like an eternity. Back outside, Maria was counting on, praying that the intruder would exit the way he came, through the garage. So you can imagine her abject horror when she saw him rushing out the front door, and she found herself again within feet of the killer. Her saving grace was the fact that he thought she was already dead, and it took him a second to understand what he was seeing. And in that second, Maria fled to the street and took cover behind a parked Volkswagen. The killer approached, and the two played a desperate game of hunter and prey, round and round that Volkswagen, until Maria actually just surrendered. She put her hands in the air and pleaded with the man. "You already shot me once. Please don't shoot me again." And he listened to her. The killer lowered his pistol and calmly walked off into the night. Maria remembers hearing a car speed away from the next block before running back into her condo and discovering Dale's body on the kitchen floor. Maria called 911 and waited for help, but the killer wasn't quite done for the night. Just a few miles west of Rosemead along the 10 freeway is the city of Monterey Park, another one of the so-called cluster of cities in the San Gabriel Valley that includes, besides Rosemead, Alhambra, San Marino, Temple City, Monterey Park, and a few others. Less than 45 minutes after the attack at the Okazaki condo in Rosemead, the killer in the stolen Toyota found another random target on the freeway. 30-year-old law student Veronica Yu was on her way home after a weekend with friends. She had classes the next day and was eager to get to bed. But Veronica was aware of her surroundings, and when a dark-haired man in a Toyota made a dangerous maneuver to cross all lanes of traffic to follow her as she exited the 10 freeway in Monterey Park, she knew something was wrong. The car stayed right behind her, regardless of the random turns she made. She began looking for a police car or a crowded street, anything to find safety, but there was nothing. So she pulled over, hoping the man would pass her by, and he did. Then Veronica made the mistake that would cost her her life. She decided to follow him. A few blocks later, on North Alhambra Avenue, they were both stopped at a red light. No other cars around, no witnesses. The man in the Toyota, fully aware that he was now the one being followed, got out of his car and approached the driver's side of Veronica's car. Veronica confronted him, demanding to know why he was following her. The man, after briefly attempting to deny the accusation by claiming he mistook her for someone he knew, went right to violence. He grabbed Veronica through the open window and tried to forcefully remove her from the car. When this failed, he hurried around to the passenger side, and before Veronica could lock the door, he gained entry to the vehicle. Then, things happened quickly. as the man pulled his .22 caliber pistol and shot Veronica beneath her right armpit. Panicked, Veronica opened her door to escape, and just as she got out of the car, she was shot a second time in the lower back. She made it out of the car, but it was too late at that point. Her wounds, especially the first wound to her chest from beneath her armpit, were fatal. Her body was found mere steps away from her car on Alhambra Avenue. As homicide detectives arrived at the home of Maria Hernandez and were told the harrowing account of what had transpired, the call came in about the Veronica Yu murder just a few miles away. Both crimes were committed with a .22 caliber weapon. The crime lab would soon make a ballistics match. And just like that, Los Angeles had a new serial murderer. Even without the connection to the Vincow murder, the fact that the killer had entered the home of his victim led the press to dub the man the Valley Intruder. The time of limbo had ended for the City of Angels. There was no longer any doubt as to the terror that her citizenry would now endure. The only question left was how long that descent into hell would last. The first detective on the scene of the Hernandez Okazaki incident was a young man named Gil Carrillo. Detective Carrillo was, in fact, the youngest in all of the LA County Sheriff's Homicide Division. And little did he know that when he was assigned the Okazaki murder in that spring of 1985, it would lead to one of the most critical investigations in the city's history and go on to define his career and his life. But he would first have to take the dangerous journey to understand the twisted mind of a killer bent on doing the devil's work. On the next episode of The Devil Within, Satan's Shadow, the killer strikes again, using the same MO and the same weapon, but this time he makes his motivations clear with a message carved into the flesh of his latest victim. Plus, we explore the second circle of Dante's Hell. That's next week on The Devil Within.
Season 4 of Satan's Shadow is available to binge wherever you listen to podcasts and is also available on YouTube. And up next, Criminal Mischief bonus content. Here, Brandon and I will discuss the case in more detail. And as always, thanks for listening.